Well, with China's apparent disquiet at being spurned by Rio Tinto, what does it mean for future trade relations with China for both Rio and even for Australia? China's concern comes against the backdrop of the country's growing economic muscle and in a climate where global trade is being hailed as essential to recovery from the economic crisis, with the G20 leaders committing themselves to trying to reach agreement in the Doha round of trade talks and to resisting protectionism. One man well placed to assess the global trade outlook is Robert Lawrence, the Professor of International Trade and Investment at Harvard University. He's currently visiting Sydney as a guest at the US Studies Centre. Professor Robert Lawrence, welcome to Lateline Business.
Thank you very much.
If we can start with an issue of the moment, the apparent Chinese wrath over their rejection by Rio Tinto. The words have been very strong, but does this really have broader implications for the trade relationship between the big iron ore miners and China, or indeed for Australia and China?
Well, they're clearly upset with what has happened, but I think it tells us something, firstly, about how quickly markets are turning around. That's really striking, that this deal, which looked reasonable at one price a few months ago, doesn't look reasonable now. I think the Chinese have a huge need for stable relationships around the world, and that isn't going to change. This is a bump in the road. But if you look at the entire Chinese trade strategy, and indeed their foreign investment strategy, it is basically driven by their huge need, voracious need for raw materials. And that's going to be there. And I think ultimately the underlying realities will dictate that there will be a strong relationship between the two countries.
This financial crisis has really highlighted China's, I guess, first of all, wealth, relative wealth, the huge foreign currency reserves, and I mean it's propping up the US government deficit at the moment, and also its desire for resources. How do you see China's future changing the global power balance, if you like?
Well, clearly, China is an emerging player, and its importance is going to grow over time. I think its ability to command financial resources currently does give it leverage. I think its emergence as a player, even in the World Trade Organization, has been significant. So yes, this is the beginning of the future in which China is a huge player in the global economy. And
what are the implications, particularly for America, of that change?
Well, I think it's going to take a lot of adjustment on the part of the US. The financial crisis is going to weaken the United States and its ability to act unilaterally. And so I see, in fact, in the foreign policy of President Obama, a warranted recognition of the importance of multilateral cooperation for the United States. And that's a change. We've seen it in the trading system. We're seeing it in the G20. This isn't a world in which the United States independently, or the United States together with the European Union, can dictate what happens. And so we're going to have to play and recognize the interests of these big players like China.
You talk about multilateral trade there, but isn't one of the issues to come out of this crisis the risk of rising protectionism? All the G20 leaders stood in London in April, hand on hearts, and said we must not be protectionist. But the reality is somewhat different, isn't it?
Well, actually, I still think the big picture is that there is a universal recognition of the dangers of protectionism. And that's one of the reasons why this crisis, hopefully, is not going to repeat the 1930s, because people intellectually understand the importance of maintaining open markets, and in fact, in terms of the global supply chains that have been developed, have real interests in maintaining open markets. Now, it is fraying at the edges. Yes, you're right. There was a pledge not to take protectionist action, but there's a lot of wiggle room in the language. And countries actually still have a lot of scope to take measures which don't contravene the rules of the World Trade Organization. So government procurement is a great case in point.
Which is becoming an issue in this country.
Well, yes, a big issue everywhere. Now, there is a government procurement agreement among the developed countries. So they can't discriminate against products coming from one another. But the developing countries haven't signed that agreement. So it's perfectly within the legal right of the United States not to buy Indian railroad ties or Chinese products through government purchases.
And what does that mean down the track, this fraying around the edges in terms of global trade, which is already forecast to decline some 10% as a result of the crisis? Longer term, where does the fraying end?
Well, I think the key question is how quick the recovery can come. You know, we can live with a little fraying, in a sense, if we get a recovery.
What's your best tip, though? Do you think we're in the scare area, or are we closer to being out of the woods?
The decline was so sharp. The kind of inventory cycle that we've seen, where suddenly demand seized up, and then people don't put in their orders. And we've seen it reverberate through global supply chains, and we've seen a decline in orders and demand and in trade. That is almost certain to have to reverse. Eventually, people are going to put in orders. Eventually, they run down the inventories. So we're going to see a recovery. I expect us to see some sort of a recovery, through towards the end of this year. But the question is how sustained it can be. And when it comes to particularly the U.S. economy and the European economies, I'm still worried. I think we'll get some recovery, but sustaining growth and reigniting growth, I think, is going to be problematic. I'm more optimistic about the developing countries, which seem to have held their own.
If your concern proves to be well-founded with the developed countries, with the US and Europe, what does that mean down the track for trade? I mean, does it basically spell the death knell for completing a multilateral round like Doha? Does it mean that this fraying around the edges of protectionism will become something we can't live with?
Well, I think there are concerns about protectionism, but in fact, particularly when I think about the United States, I think our interest in trade negotiations is actually going to grow over time. You see, if you
multilateral or bilateral?
Well, both. I think if you ask yourself the question, where will the demand come from to reignite the U.S. economy? The housing market is depressed. Investment, we have huge levels of unused capacity. The government is currently carrying the full load, but it's not sustainable over a long-run period of time. So America is going to have to adjust, I think, through more exports. And so how do you reignite your exports? Well, one possibility is a weaker dollar. Probably we'll see that. But the second one is to try to encourage others to open their markets to your products. So I think an American president who is concerned about his national interest will want to see the global trading system succeed. And that's why I think, paradoxically perhaps, even under difficult circumstances, we're going to rediscover the importance of the world trading system in the United States.
Professor Lawrence, many thanks for joining us.
You're most welcome.